There's an impressive language barrier between us and almost 20% of the population. How can we bridge that gap and begin to communicate more fully with our neighbors? We talk to people every day, on the street, in the store, at home, and rarely do we think about how amazing it is that we can actually communicate with them. We constantly take for granted our ability to converse with those around us. Now, 58.9 million of our neighbors here in the United States are Spanish speakers. Imagine that for a moment. There's an impressive language barrier between us and almost 20% of the population. How can we bridge that gap and begin to communicate more fully with our neighbors? Well, we can start by perfecting our Spanish learning process. Let's think about how most of us have tried to learn Spanish. Workbooks with reading and writing exercises, large classroom settings, non-native Spanish-speaking instructors, software, free or paid, with audio recordings, classes only 1 or 2 times per week. Did one of those methods work for you? More than likely, they did not, because these techniques utilize the wrong parts of the brain. Remember the list we made of the different ways we normally try to learn Spanish? Those are what we are going to call traditional learning methods. Let's explore further to see where exactly they went wrong. If you're like me and went to public school, the norm was that you took about a year of foreign language in middle school before it became a requirement in high school. Since I studied in Texas, Spanish was the most logical choice of a second language. However, it wasn't like I had much of a choice since German and French were my only other options. So I began to study Spanish only because of its practicality. Now, on a personal level, Spanish was my least favorite class. I was a pretty good student overall, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't do better than a B-. Yeah, I know, I was kind of an overachiever. At some point, I owned the fact that I wasn't good at learning languages and just gave up. I stopped trying, which was quite contrary to my personality. Looking back, I can point to several things that probably held me back. Common learning errors. First of which, large classes. I was in a 5A district, which means I was studying at a high school of over 5,000 plus students. My graduating class was over 1,000 students. In other words, the classrooms were consistently filled to capacity. Another reason, limited attention. Due to the high student count, how much attention could one teacher realistically give to any one student? How does anyone stay focused when they're just another face in the crowd? Limited practice. Our classes, if I remember correctly, were approximately 50 minutes. Later, they shifted to an hour and 20 minutes in high school. Within those 80 minutes, I experienced about 10 minutes of actual application time. However, we weren't speaking with actual native speakers. Instead, we stammered broken phrases to other non-Spanish speakers for a couple of minutes until we got distracted by a more interesting topic, workbooks. Given the limited class time practice, most of our actual Spanish work was assigned to us as homework. That meant we mainly learned about reading and writing the rules of Spanish language in class, and then later perfected them, or at least attempted to, outside of class. I would actually argue that my reading and writing got pretty decent, but I couldn't speak the language if my life depended on it. Wrong reinforcement. In hindsight, it's clear that my Spanish language journey is flawed since day one. I was learning how to read and write in Spanish, but I barely flexed my auditory and speaking muscles. The lessons, activities, and practice, all that work was constantly reinforcing reading and writing Spanish, nothing else. Now let me be clear, I'm definitely not saying that software and textbooks that focus on those learning areas are insignificant. I truly believe that they can be helpful. However, I'm simply saying that they are only one part of a much bigger picture. We need various tools to activate the key areas of the brain that will help us effectively learn Spanish fast. Before we can begin to learn Spanish fast, we must have a better understanding of how the brain functions when learning a new language. How the brain works. The brain is a very complex organ in the human body. It controls everything we do, whether that's reading, writing, or speaking. The brain has to be trained over time to know how to complete all of those tasks. Although the brain is much more complex than we can actually delve in here today, it's clear that looking from this diagram that different language functions are primarily controlled by distinct areas of the brain. What this shows us is that when we try to learn a language with just reading or writing exercises, it isn't very effective because we aren't exercising the parts of the brain that control speech. We're only learning half of what we need to become fluent in Spanish. In other words, as a learning audience, we have to be studying and learning Spanish correctly. Brain tasks. In a nutshell, our brain accomplishes any task by firing or sending electrical signals to different regions of the brain. These signals then travel throughout the body to the muscles that you want to use. So, for example, let's just say you want to say something. Your brain would first need to send out signals to different parts of the brain to recall those words and then form a sentence and use that structure to whatever you need. Then it would need to send signals to those muscles to move correctly, those vocal cords, let's say, to pronounce this correct sound. Wow, that's a lot of tasks. No wonder language is a hard thing to learn, right? Becoming more efficient. These electrical signals we just talked about travel along something called axons. However, the further the signals have to travel, the more energy they lose. Luckily, our axons are wrapped in a fatty substance called myelin, which helps maintain their energy. You can think of these axons like coaxial cables of the brain. When we're younger, this myelin fatty substance is quite thin. The more we practice, quote unquote, specific tasks though, the more resources your body actually dedicates to that axon and then thickens the myelin. This in turn produces a very well insulated pathway for that particular electrical signal. In this TED video right here, it explores that idea further. They refer to it as something similar to an informational superhighway. Logically speaking then, as a signal becomes fast and more efficient, the result should appear quicker and better, right? That makes sense. Targeting the correct objective. The answer is yes, but to make that signal faster, we need to practice the right tasks. If we want to create efficient pathways in our brain for speaking Spanish, but never say a word, those pathways will never develop. We must target the correct objective then when we're learning Spanish. At this point, I guess I can probably conclude that I didn't excel in high school Spanish, not because I'm horrible at Spanish, but because the curriculum and the activities were creating and reinforcing axion pathways in my brain, specifically for reading and writing. Had I been able to converse and develop pathways for speaking, well, I would have been more proficient in communicating in Spanish. There's a common saying, that practice how you execute. And it rings true for language learning too. More than practice, quality, and effectiveness. The video that I previously mentioned goes on to point out that although practice is necessary to build up the myelin along your axions, it's not the only thing needed to develop mastery over any skill set, including speaking Spanish. This explains why repeating a bunch of words randomly or without context often does not lead to Spanish fluency. So, we've talked about how traditional learning methods are ineffective. What then is the correct way to learn Spanish quickly? Well, I'll tell you how we do it. At Spanish Academy, we've developed a very unique method of teaching Spanish that centers around 5 key concepts represented by the acronym RAMA. These letters stand for relevance, attention, meaning, memory, and last but not least, accountability. Relevance. Our classes are either one-on-one or two-on-one, giving you the ability to talk about things that are relevant to your life. This does a couple of things. First, it gives your brain a point of reference that allows you to contextualize and process what's actually going on. It also aids in pushing the information into your long-term memory. Attention. Because the information is actually relevant to your experience, you're naturally more engaged in the class. Studies show time and time again that when you're attentive, your brain is more likely to retain the information. Meaning, now that the classes are relevant to your experiences, you can learn Spanish through a lens that you're familiar with. This gives meaning and perspective to your Spanish learning journey. Instead of just learning a bunch of generic words and phrases that you might never use, you'll actually learn useful and meaningful vocabulary, grammar, and conversational skills. Memory. Just like being attentive allows you to store information in your long-term memory, giving meaning to the context allows you to do the same. All that context, perspective, and meaning lets you process and store this information a lot faster than if you were just trying to memorize things in a list of words. Accountability. Of course, repetition plays an important part in our language learning. That's where the last letter comes in. A for accountability. To continue with something that's difficult, you need guidance and direction, or in other words, accountability. This is one of the most important things that people often forget or don't include in their learning regimen. Why? Because they just don't think that it's important. However, it can actually shorten your learning curve by avoiding mistakes that you might otherwise make. Think of your Spanish teacher very similar to something like a Google Maps. You're still able to get from where you want to go to where you want to be without Google Maps, but let's face it, it's a lot faster with Google Maps leading the way. In many parts of America, there actually are people who feel that other languages should not be spoken or used in public. Now, without getting political here, I think one of those reasons for this is that people find it really hard to learn Spanish or any other language for that matter. And it's challenging, don't get me wrong, but it can be easier than people make it out to be if they just practice and learn Spanish correctly. So, it's time to throw out all of those traditional methods and start learning Spanish in a new and effective way today. Go ahead and click here to learn even more about how our program can help you learn Spanish fast. Or go ahead, sign up and experience it for yourself through a free class. We can't wait to see you in class. Adios. Thanks for watching, guys. We couldn't do it without you. Please be sure to click the like button, hit subscribe, and click on the bell notification to receive our future videos. Ciao!